All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're cracking open a seriously unusual medical case study. We are looking at a patient presenting with an incredibly stubborn, totally incurable condition. But hey, this isn't your standard medical file. The source material we're analyzing actually frames this profound, uncontrollable urge to move as a literal contagion, a funky dancing heart, if you will. We're going to unpack this fascinating narrative of a patient who completely rejects clinical sterility for pure, unadulterated groove. I'm so excited to guide you through this because it just beautifully illustrates that clash between rigid institutional control and the undeniable power of human expression. So right off the bat, during the intake process, we get this absolutely incredible statement. The medical staff, they're searching for a pathology, a problem to solve. But the patient completely flips the script with this deadpan delivery. They say I've got a condition. Yeah, it's called rhythm. Boom! They own the diagnosis immediately. They aren't denying that something is happening to their body, but they're absolutely denying that it's an illness. It's such a brilliant way to establish the central conflict here. Who gets to define what's normal and what's a symptom? Which brings us to Phase 1, patient intake and environmental observations. Now, just picture the intense contrast between the hospital's baseline environment and the patient's internal state. On one hand, it's incredibly rigid and measured. Think white walls, ticking clocks, soft shoes walking in literal square blocks. It's entirely muted. But then, against those ticking clocks, the patient's heartbeat is just totally off their time. While the hospital demands those square blocks and quiet, the patient is feeling the sound. They're shaking the ground. The environment is screaming, "Sit down and stay in line," but the patient's internal rhythm is already physically rebelling against the architecture itself.
As the intake continues, the patient is closely observing the staff. You've got clipboards talking, doctors nodding slowly, asking the patient to tell them all these things they need to know, but the patient? They actively reject all of it. By telling the doctor, "Doc, it's pretty clear, the problem's not inside of here," the patient is making this really profound observation. They're insisting that the institution's rigid rules, the muted tones, that intense demand for absolute stillness, well, that's the actual sickness. The urge to dance isn't the problem at all. The environment suppressing it is.
Moving right along to Phase 2, symptom progression and transmission. Because, let's be real, this condition isn't staying private for long. The progression of this disease is just fascinating. Instead of doing what they're told, breathing in, counting to 10 to calm down, the patient initiates a full-on groove sequence. Step 1, they hear a baseline startup. Step 2, they catch the beat. Step 3 is the physical manifestation, just tapping softly with their feet. And then, the absolutely critical fourth step, transmission. A nurse walks by, does a double take, and the patient just starts to grin. Why? Because this rhythm is highly contagious. The patient realizes that, despite her strict uniform, the nurse is secretly dancing deep down too. The infection has officially spread.
You can see a fundamental communication breakdown happening here. The medical staff's entire paradigm is built on control. They're saying stay still, see control, write it down, but the patient's reality, it's entirely sensory and kinetic. Where the staff sees the need for strict control, the patient just feels the sound. You tell them to stay still, they shake the ground. You write it down, they start to move. It's a complete, utter failure of the medical model to contain human kinetic energy.
Naturally, the institution classifies this uncontrollable urge to break out and dance as madness. It's a deviation from the norm, so obviously, it must be crazy, right? But think about how confidently the patient reframes that definition. They redefine madness as chance. They redefine it as art. They summarize their entire condition simply as a funky dancing heart. It is this beautiful reclamation of a clinical label, turning a supposed pathology into a point of immense pride.
And that sparks Phase 3, failed treatments and the groove rebellion.
Because, of course, the medical establishment decides to escalate things. The staff breaks out their standard tools, but they completely misfire. They try making charts for every single move the patient makes, but the patient's reality? There are absolutely no charts that can measure the kind of joy being generated here. Next up, they offer pills for every possible state of mind. But once again, the medical arsenal falls way short. There are no pills for when the groove just feels right. The institution is basically trying to quantify and medicate an experience that is fundamentally unquantifiable and just deeply human. Realizing the hospital has absolutely nothing to offer, the patient's focus shifts entirely away from those rubber floors and muted tones. Their mind is already miles out beyond those hospital doors. They're visualizing neon lights, they're anticipating shaking floors, they hear a calling beat. And they identify all of this, the club, the dance floor, the music, as a vastly superior form of therapy. They're literally prescribing their own cure, and it requires leaving the sterile ward completely behind.
Which brings us to the real climax of our case study. The doctor makes one final desperate attempt at maintaining clinical order, sternly saying, "Remain calm." And the patient's response, literally and physically, is essentially, "Yeah, good luck with that." This is the turning point where the clinical tone just shatters completely. The rhythm violently builds, the beat drops, and the patient officially, joyfully rebels against the doctor's orders. Staying calm? Yeah, that is no longer an option.
And that leads us perfectly into Phase 4, Final Prognosis.
So here's the final evaluation of this entirely uncontainable condition. The symptoms of this incurable groove are now permanent. The patient emphatically refuses any cure. They report a strong, pure rhythm right in their veins, demanding an existence with no rules, no walls, simply bending to the beat. And in the ultimate act of defiance, when the doctors try to write them up one last time, the patient simply spins around and calls it a new trick, proving once and for all that no clinical label will ever stick to them because they are officially and proudly certified to dance.
Which leaves us with this final, kind of cheeky thought to wrap up our explainer. If loving this groove is wrong, why fix it? Seriously, in a sterile corporate world so obsessed with control, measurement, and keeping everyone walking in perfectly square blocks, maybe catching this infectious rhythm isn't a disease at all. Maybe, just maybe, an uncontrollable urge to break out and dance is exactly the kind of madness we all really need. So what do you think? Are you ready to catch the rhythm?